Hello and welcome to Media7. In this week's program we will look at two very different topics. One is the emergence of New Zealand's military role in Afghanistan as a media issue, and later we'll discuss the place of music journalism in the age of Twitter and MP3 blogs, assuming there is one, from the point of view of both the practitioner and the subject. But first we look to Afghanistan. 8 years into the Western military operation, its costs mount and its goals seem less clear than ever. And yet, New Zealand is among the nations being asked by new American leadership to recommit to the effort. Simon Pound looks at how the debate is playing out.
The Afghanistan conflict is 8 years in, and world media is starting to ask, why?
So far this month, British soldiers have been dying in Afghanistan at a rate of more than one each day. What are we doing there?
Locally, print is making the running, with the Herald's Patrick Gower filing front-page stories and video reports.
A New Zealand Herald report. Patrick Gower.
While the Sunday Star Times has had coverage and analysis from John Stevenson, front and centre. The Dominion Post also ran a great boys' own cover. But these excellent stories are the exception. Are we seeing enough coverage of Afghanistan in the media?
Joining me now are Patrick Gower, who filed that series of written and video reports from Afghanistan for the New Zealand Herald, Dr. Steve Hoadley, Associate Professor in Political Studies at the University of Auckland, and John Stevenson, who wrote the front page story for the Sunday Star Times, reviving concerns that our troops may have committed a war crime by handing over captives to US forces. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Patrick, could we start with you, and let's get this out of the way now. You made your trip to Afghanistan with the support of the US State Department. What was the editorial discussion you had around that before accepting it?
Well, you know, obviously it's not ideal to go on any sort of journalistic trip with, sponsored journalism effectively. But in my opinion, and the opinion of my editors, that was so important to get over there and get on the ground before the New Zealand government made the upcoming decision about whether or not to send the SAS in.
What could you get through being on the ground that you couldn't get any other way?
Well, you can get a feel for what the United States wants over there. And it was pretty obvious when I got there that they wanted not just for us to continue our contributions, but to up them, and that they wanted to essentially for us to send back the combat troops and keep on our provincial reconstruction team. And it turns out in New Zealand, perhaps we're more interested in sending back the combat troops and not sending back the reconstruction team.
What, on the other hand, do you think the US government's interest in extending that offer was? Because I presume we're not the only country where this has happened, where they've gone to a major media organisation.
The United States' interest is pretty clear. You know, it's obvious they're on a big PR drive. They've got a new plan, Barack Obama's in, and they want the world to know that. My job as a journalist when I was over there is to see past that and, you know, look at what is really going on. And I guess being on a sponsored trip, you sort of feel even more vigilant than normal about what's going on over there.
You also shot your own video reports. Did you have any training to use a camera or anything? I thought that was quite interesting.
No, I just picked one up at Dick Smith sort of on the day before I left. Yeah. So, I'm pleased to hear you say that.
Oh, maybe you're a natural.
I think one of the important things to raise is that, even though I was on a sponsored trip, it didn't mean that, I couldn't do stories that necessarily didn't reflect well on the US. And indeed, on the way over there, I stopped at the NATO headquarters, and the US ambassador there was pretty emphatic about the reasons that New Zealand should be involved in Afghanistan, and those were that, to be a good ally in case we ever needed help out here. And when I came back, I reported that story. And, I don't think that sort of necessarily reflects well on the US or our reasons for being involved there.
And that was the first one that was published as well. Was that published first purely because it was the first one you got?
It was published first because I wanted to give readers and the public the political backdrop to this decision that was coming up. I work in Parliament, and I'd heard politicians speaking about our reasons for being involved in the war, and the reasons they gave was, New Zealanders travel widely, we don't want Afghanistan being a hotbed for terrorism. So when I spoke to the ambassador and he, I asked him straight up, why should we be involved in this war? Public interest is flagging, not just in New Zealand, but around the world. And when he responded that, we should be in it to be a good ally, that was directly contrary to what we're hearing in New Zealand, and therefore the newsworthiness. And I used that story first to as I said, put the backdrop there for this very, very big decision we're making. It's obvious that the United States and the New Zealand government have been trying to ease our combat troops back into this war. And by going over there, I was able to identify that, look, this is coming up. This is the pressure that New Zealand's under, and it was important, I think, to get that out before the decision was made, and so New Zealanders can at least have some time to debate about it and talk about it publicly. And I think that's been one of the limitations with coverage of the Afghanistan war in New Zealand, and that you might get a lot in the world pages and so on and so forth, but there hasn't been a lot directly related to what we're doing over there. And you'll find a lot of New Zealanders sort of think Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, Willie Apiata, and there's a lack of understanding about what's really going on over there. And, that's why getting over there, being able to ask the Americans, what's the exit strategy, what plans have you got for us, was, in my opinion, really, really important before this decision is made.
Steve, I think Patrick's right there. These stories, we ran through the stories at the top of the show there, they are timely because this decision that our government will make next week is a major one, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. It's a bit of a turning point in some respects. If Afghanistan goes bad, it will reflect bad on the government. If Afghanistan holds on and peace is restored in the longer term, it'll reflect well on the current national government. Should
we have been reading stories like Patrick's and John's sooner?
Absolutely. I think these are very timely. They should have come along a little bit earlier. On the other hand, Navy Today, Air Force News, Army News, the NZDF public relations people are trying really hard to put the story out in front of the public. There isn't much consumption. There isn't much interest in people doing good things, helping kids to school, building buildings, latrines.
Well, as Simon pointed out, they did get their one boy's own story on the Dom Post this week, though.
Yes.
So how much of that do you think is going on, that there is messaging coming from the Defence Forces themselves? Because that's got to be an issue for journalists too, doesn't it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's up to the Minister to carry the ball. The Defence Force must take their lead from him and from Wayne Mapp in this case, or from the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister. And it's up to them to educate the people and show the way to the Defence Force and the practitioners in the field, the police and the civilians, so they can tell their story within the broad guidelines of New Zealand policy.
Now, John, you always strike me as someone who likes to operate outside the guidelines, and indeed, you got to Afghanistan in 2001 and reported for the Sunday Star Times. Would that be possible now? You just going in on your own?
It's possible, but it is very, very difficult and very, very dangerous, which is why we have to take our hats off to Patrick, because he's had the guts to go back there at a time when a lot of people are dying. And, it is a very difficult and dangerous assignment. You can't expect someone, with all due respect to Patrick, who's a gallery journalist, without the training, without the expertise, without the contacts, to go wandering around Afghanistan asking questions of the locals.
So what did you do when you were there? Did you wander around? Or?
Yeah, I did. I guess I volunteered for it. The difference is, Patrick's obviously a salaried journalist, and if he went, his employer, of course, the Herald, has a duty of care. There are insurance issues and there are legal issues, and of course I'm sure his wife would have a say in it as well. But I think within the constraints of what he did, what he operated under, he did very well. He put the story on the front page of the Herald for 5 days. He got a lot of videos. He worked very hard. I think we need to tip our hats and say, it's not the whole story, but it is a very important part of the story. There are excuses for not going and wandering around Afghanistan. What there are not excuses for are journalists in New Zealand asking the hard questions of ministers, of military officials. That's something there's absolutely no excuse for. And I'd like to know why journalists here in the gallery, for example, don't ask questions about Kennedy Graham's non-aggression bill. Why at John Key's post-cabinet press conference on Monday, there was not one question raised about Patrick's stories or mine. Not one.
I'd like to pick up on that and talk about the experience of being on the ground and being able to question the American sport. Because when I was able to get back to New Zealand and ask John Key about some of the things I'd seen and heard, You know, it was like you'd just been able to drive in a bit. There was more information and you could draw him out of what he was talking about. And we'd never heard, you know, that he wanted to remove the provincial reconstruction team. We'd never heard that he wasn't keen on using the SAS in a training or mentoring role. And when you're in New Zealand and you're trying to do things over your computer or through Google, you can only get so much. But by getting over there, getting American officials on the record and then being able to bring that back, you know, it helps.
Do you think that drew out policy that was already there, or was he making decisions based on what you'd asked him, or have they got it mapped out, they know what they're going to do?
I think we're in a classic public softening up phase where we're sort of hearing dribs and drabs about the SAS going back and nice things about them fighting terrorism. I think the government's finding it incredibly difficult, the political risk involved of sending combat troops back, and to put it bluntly, body bags, and what looks to me as a sort of a war where, you know, it's 50-50 here in New Zealand at the moment whether we should do it, could easily swing around to 60-40. So they're going through a difficult phase, but I think there's been some decisions made in the background.
Actually, could we go to John, because he's written the other story we're discussing. Now, the potential war crime story isn't in itself new. David Beatson, in particular on Pundit, has been pursuing it. What was new in your story?
Well, I think it's important to say that, once again, David Beatson's made an important contribution to the debate. I don't know whether he's quite entitled to feel as pleased about himself as he seems to be on Pundit.
You can discuss that.
Yeah, I'll take that with him after the show. But I think, once again, you don't have to agree with the stories or agree that he's got all his facts right. I happen to believe that he hasn't. But I think it's important, again, that you've got that debate. I mean, there's no more serious and difficult decision that a government faces than whether to commit its young men and women to a war. These people, as Patrick rightly said, are going off to war in a very difficult and dangerous place. And I think we've got to listen to people like Rhys Jones, the Chief of the Army. He said last year that if people keep going back there, someone's going to come home in a body bag.
And Steve, actually, if we could go to you, I mean, the subject of John's story, there's something ironic in one of the perils facing our troops being, in this case anyway, breaching the Geneva Conventions for handing over captives to the good guys, to our allies.
Yes,
it's a complicated place, isn't it?
As Brigadier Kevin Riordan said, that wasn't apparent at the time. New Zealand troops acted in good faith. They expected decent treatment to the prisoners. That hasn't happened. Okay, in retrospect, the SAS will be much careful if they're in that position again. I think we shouldn't condemn without knowing the circumstances of the time.
Well, can I just add to that? I think it's something very, very important that we've got to get on the record, and it should have been clear in the story, and if it wasn't, then I want to make it very clear now. There's no question, there's no allegation that any New Zealand soldier did anything untoward. That's not the issue. The issue is that they were placed in an invidious situation where the leadership back home, political and military, in my view, let them down, failed them, put them in a situation where they had the knowledge before they had those prisoners that there were concerns, that the United States had said that these people would be effectively outside the law. There were warning signs before Abu Ghraib. That's the big mantra that we didn't know until Abu Ghraib. That's not true. And those soldiers were put in a position where they technically could be liable for some pretty serious breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Steve,
would the Defence Force Command be having that conversation if it hadn't been for the likes of John and David Beatson writing these stories, making it an issue?
And Audrey Young, I think we should say, who also wrote a story in the Herald.
Yeah, the NZDF has an elaborate program of education, of indoctrination, if you wish, on the Geneva Convention rules. They have graduated tiers for officers, people in the field, ordinary sailors and so forth, so that they all get some information and some indication of what the Geneva Conventions apply, how they apply to individual circumstances. So it's not for want of trying in the NZDF. Now, perhaps it was as a result of the earlier incident, but this has been going on for at least 10 years that I'm aware of, and it is all part of the standard training at all levels of the NZDF.
Well, we'll take a break now, and when we come back, we'll try and look over the horizon in Afghanistan.